Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we're unable to get to them during the presentation, we'll make sure they're answered by the end. My name is Braden Knutson. I will be your host for this webinar. We'd like to remind everyone that all of these webinars are being recorded and posted onto our website, as well as onto the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. We encourage everyone to subscribe so you can receive updates about new videos that are posted and continue to watch all of the videos we have up there. We currently have about 190 videos on our YouTube channel, and that number is increasing every week. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Using First-Level Genealogical Sources, Vital Records, Censuses, Cemetery Records, Obituaries, and Biographies. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. So we'll turn the time over to James and let him take it away for us.
Howdy, this is James Tanner, and we welcome you to another in the series of Brigham Young University Family History Library webinars, and remind you all that these webinars are being recorded and will be uploaded to the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. And we'd also invite you to subscribe to the channel, and then you'll receive notice from Google about any new videos that are posted. We're going to talk today about using first-level genealogical sources, vital records, censuses, cemetery records, obituaries, and biographies. And I guess we might want to ask is, why are we calling these first-level records? And I guess I would characterize a lot of them as low-hanging fruit, meaning there's a couple of things that qualify these records as being first level, and that is their availability. They're very available. Many of these are, in fact, like the census records, are repeated, copied on different websites, some free, some paid. Most all of these have multiple copies on different websites, and availability is very, very common. In addition, most of these are also available on a free website, familysearch.org, and familysearch.org, of course, even if you didn't own a computer, would be available at a local library or at one of the 4,900 plus family history centers around the world. So there's a fairly high level of availability. Additionally, the issue here is records. The records which have been preserved and are available for anyone for research purposes. And the general way that records have been preserved in the world are based on the time level. For example, most of the records for people born in the last 200 years to 250 years in the United States are very, very available and very research that you can do a lot of research. Past 1800 going into the 1700s is every time you go back another 100 years, the difficulty, the number of levels of records decreases dramatically, and the availability of the records also decreases dramatically. So these are that's part of this concern here. But what we're going to focus on today are those that you can get to rather easily, and should give you pretty good insight into the first 3 or 4 generations of your family in the United States. Now, if you're an immigrant or your family was an immigrant from another country, it would obviously depend on the record availability in that country, which may be vastly different than the United States. I would suggest this order. First of all, vital records. Vital records consist of birth, marriage, and death records, and all of the kind of iterations that go with those, such as divorces and burial records and things like that. And these are all very much available for the last 150 years or so, and are fairly easy to find when I say fairly easy, I mean comparatively easy to find in the indexed records, which are available online in the larger websites such as Family Search or Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, and others. The second one, of course, are census records. Census records are very complete for the United States. The only census that's missing is the 1890 census, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go through here through this presentation. But the census records are very, very thorough. It is sometimes not possible to find a family in every single census, but generally if a person lived in the United States from 1850 to the present, there's a way to find that person in a census. It's kind of a general rule. Next are cemetery records. Surprisingly, they're very, very extensive. We'll go into some of the ways that we can search cemetery records, but they are also extremely available today. We have one very, very large website called Find a Grave that has well over 100 million burials and increases constantly the coverage throughout the world, but primarily in the United States. And then obituaries are an extremely good place to go to get records. These are all found in newspapers, and today we have literally millions and millions of pages of digital newspapers available in a number of, actually in hundreds of websites. There are some very, very large websites that have huge, huge collections of online digital newspapers, but primarily these are available, and they do require a little bit more work. As you move down this order here, you're actually increasing the level of research work that would have to be done to find any given ancestor. Biographies. Surprisingly, there are a lot of biographies out there, and many people are surprised to find out that their ancestors were mentioned or have a biography in any number of different kinds of publications, and we'll talk about that. And now, looking at each one of these, we'll decide, as I mentioned a second ago, that these are first-level sources. Number one, because they're digitized and searchable online. Most are available for the last 100 to 200 years, and they're usually the records new genealogists search first. So these are the records that people automatically think of. Now, I have kind of a counter experience in my life. Obviously started many years before there were computers and online programs available for searching, and my initial experiences with the U.S. Census records were on microfilm and were very negative, and I basically didn't look at U.S. Census records until they were digitized online and mostly indexed. So I didn't think they were one of the easier records to look at initially, but they are today much easier to find and look at than they were just a few years ago. And these are all records that are mostly easy to read and understand. We're not getting into, except for handwriting issues, of course. A lot of these records will turn out to be written by hand, and it does take some level of satisfaction of experience to understand and read this old handwriting. And by the way, the younger you are, the more likely it is to be a problem, because most of the students today only have a very superficial experience with writing cursive and reading cursive. And last, they have a very good coverage by the bigger online genealogy database programs, as I've already mentioned. Well, let's look first at vital records. Vital records deal with birth, with marriages, and with death. And these are the events that are recorded. Uh, but we need to understand some of the issues that are involved with vital records. For example, birth certificates are a relatively new development. The first compulsory registration of births with governmental agencies originated in the United Kingdom in 1853. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the governments did not keep track of births before 1853. Now, in the United States, that was U.S. standardized birth registrations began about 1902. That's relatively recent. And so when people start saying they come in to talk at the libraries, for example, and they say, I'm looking for my great-grandfather's birth certificates, and I ask the date, they say back in 1850, and I say, sorry, they didn't even have birth certificates in 1850. And of course, they're lost at that point because they don't know where else to go to find the birth. Well, birth records extend much beyond the concept of an official governmental created birth certificate. So what we need to understand from this is that even that some states did not have complete compliance until the 1920s. So finding a birth certificate for anyone who was born before 1900 in the United States may or may not occur. You may be able to find a birth record, someone who made a record of the birth. It could have been recorded in anything from a newspaper to a town record to a family Bible or any other place. Church records are probably the next best place to find birth records. But there was really no uniform recording and reporting of birth records at all. And so in the United States, all birth records are kept by the states. And so they each have a different method and a different, slightly different way that the records are kept. And that requires the researcher to adapt to those differences between each of the states as depending on where your ancestors originated. So where are the birth records? That'd be the next question. And the first one is most are held by the Department of Health Services of the various states. Now there's something very interesting about this, that most states charge for copies. But there are a few older digital copies online of birth records. So what's happened here is the states view supplying a birth certificate, for example, as a money-making operation. If you've been involved in ordering extra copies of a birth certificate, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They also have two levels of copies of birth records, certified and just a regular copy. So they have two levels of charging. As genealogists, we generally do not need certified copies of birth records, and so we can save a little money if we need to by simply getting a regular copy of the record. This creates another problem, and that is there are third-party companies out there that charge to find birth certificates. If you put in search on Google, for example, for a birth certificate in any state in the United States, but let's say you did it for Utah or for any state back east, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, whatever. What you're going to see is maybe multiple pages of companies offering to get you a birth certificate. None of these, by the way, are particularly government sanctioned, and all they are going to do is do what you would need to do, and that is go to the state department that provides birth certificates and pay the fee and get the birth certificate. And then what they do is they do that for you, fill out the online form, send it in, get the birth certificate, turn around and send it to you and charge you a premium, an amount over the cost that the state would charge you to get the same thing. So when you're working on any of these types of records and obtaining records from the state, make sure that you are actually dealing with the state, not dealing with some third-party company. There's no reason to do that. There's no reason. They have no greater insight or ability to get you a birth certificate than you can get yourself going straight through the state. And the additional thing here is that in most states there are restrictions on who can obtain a birth certificate. So if you are requesting one for a remote ancestor, you may end up filling out a quite a lengthy um, questionnaire, an application form, proving to the state that you have some legitimate reason or interest for obtaining that birth certificate. And if you're trying to find a birth certificate for a cousin, a relative who is not a direct line relative, you may have difficulty doing that. Um, the good news is that when the older the birth certificates get, the less difficulty there is in getting a copy. Now we need to go into the issue of what is birth information versus a birth record. In this case, birth information comes from records that document when a person was born, and surprisingly, almost any type of record may contain birth information. There are just a whole list of these. Family records, including Bibles, I mentioned this a moment ago, and then church records are a primary source of information about birth. A lot of people I assist in getting started with their family history are surprised when I start to quiz them about what religion their ancestors had, as if that would matter to them. And as a matter of fact, as a genealogist, it matters a great deal, because the church records are where you're going to find most of this type of information. And obviously, in order to find the church records, you have to know what church they belong to. And it doesn't have anything to do with their particular beliefs. It just has to do with who might have the records and where the records might be located. Probate records. This is a process where after a person dies, there's a court monitored procedure for distributing their worldly goods and their real estate and whatever to their heirs. And these probate actions usually contain information about the deceased individual, and may very, very frequently make a reference to their age or their when they died or when they were born, and they're a very good source of that type of information. Surprisingly, land records may contain that type of information. You can find deeds and other types of records that may tell you, maybe not exactly, but may give you a very good idea of when someone was born based on finding a land record. Immigration and naturalization records. These records are very, very good for finding details, particularly about the origin of an immigrant. These also are records that have gotten more detailed as time has passed. Immigration and naturalization were not really regulated until almost the 1900s by the federal government. And so the records that exist from before 1906 is when the federal government took over naturalization and put that into the federal court system. When they did that, the amount of information that was obtained from the prospective naturalization person who wanted to become a citizen was much more extensive than was required by the states previously. Immigration was never, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was not regulated except by the various states until well into the end of the 1800s. So these records, once they were created and once they were maintained, can provide valuable information and usually require the birth information. Military records, this is kind of a double sword here, because military records are excellent for finding information about the birth and birth location of individuals, except for one very small factor, and that was that if a young man was trying to get into the Army or the Navy, they would very frequently, and more frequently than we would suspect, lied about their age, because if they were 16 and 17 and a pretty big young man, they just would say they were old enough to get in. They were 18 years of age, and that's what went on the military records. So in most cases, though, people were straightforward, honest, and gave their birth date to the government or to the whoever was taking in the particular military record. Cemetery records are really good for births, death certificates, and all sorts of everything between a death certificate and a burial record are usually mention how old the person was, or how or when they were born. However, these records need to be reviewed with a little bit of skepticism, because they're being created by people, particularly after the person dies, a cemetery record, who may not really know when the person was born, and they may be doing that out of memory rather than providing anything that was official about the birth of the person. That goes also for grave markers, tombstones, headstones. It is not unusual to find that the information concerning a birth is inaccurately recorded on a headstone, simply for the same reason that it was created at a time, usually sometimes much after the time that the person died. And census records are traditionally off. There are a few census years that record the month and year of a person's birth, but even then it was subject to memory, and it was also subject to the people changing the dates for whatever reason, perhaps because they were underage when they got married, or for whatever other cultural reason that they may have decided that telling their true age was not a very good idea. And census records are always taken at a particular date during the census year. And if a person was born before that date, then the age that's given may be different than if they were born after that date. And so census records are, as we say, usually off by at least a year. Very commonly, let's put it that way, very commonly off by at least 1 year from the actual age of the person being recorded. Newspapers. You may have two different opinions about newspapers. That if you've ever had an article written about yourself personally, anything that you were involved in as an individual and were participating in, you probably have at least a healthy skepticism for the accuracy of newspapers. But as far as reporting births and deaths, many newspapers did this routinely for years, and their records are probably about as accurate as any of the other records that have been created to record births and deaths. Okay, well, let's move on to marriage records. Now, marriage records are the oldest and most common of the vital records. If I were going to suggest to anyone to begin a search for records for their ancestors, I would suggest that they start with marriage records. There's something to be said about starting with death records, because death records are arguably closer to the present than the other records that may be available for a family. But I think that the permanency and the availability of marriage records outweighs any of those kinds of arguments of just simple difference in a few years' time. Marriage records, marriages as an institution affects property ownership, and as such, marriages are usually recorded, and the information about the marriage is preserved as part of land ownership records. And so they are there's very much more likely to be finding a marriage record in early records in the United States and elsewhere than you would any of the other types. In fact, the earliest marriage records date back to the 5th century BC, and they're found in the Elephantine papyri from Egypt. So, they've been around for a long, long time, and people have continually recorded marriages. Um, because they affect property ownership, uh, that one way to find out information about a marriage is to look at property records, and talk about that a little bit more here just in a minute. And this is again my suggestion that we search for marriage records first. So where are they? Where are we going to go to look for marriage records? Marriage records are in U.S. counties. So if you're looking for a marriage record in whatever state of the United States, you're going to need to know uh, where that person was married and which county that person was married in order to find their marriage record. Now, fortunately, on the bigger websites that have millions of these types of records, you can search for the individual by name and by place, and you may be able to find the county simply by searching for this type of record. But if you're not finding your person in those larger websites, then you may have to do some more research and figure out which county they were married in, and then search the county records for the marriage. As I mentioned earlier, they are also kept by churches. This is something that there may be two records. There may be a record of the people's marriage in the church, and there may be another record of their marriage civilly from the government, so that and even what may even happen is that those two dates do not agree, that they got married civilly and then later got married by the church, or they got married by the church and then later got married civilly. One or the other may have been before the other, and depending on the time period and the requirements and what kind of registrations were made. Any of these older records, including marriage records, may end up in a state library or archive, or even into a historical society. I would also mention they might end up in some other type of repository, such as a special collections library in a university, or a private organization like a museum or any other place that might keep older records. There are many, many record marriages online. Right now, findmypast.com has over 100 million records with 450 million names from 2,800 of the 3,000 counties in the United States, and they're in the process of being indexed. This is a huge ongoing volunteer indexing program being primarily spearheaded by FamilySearch.org to index all of these marriages. But this covers nearly the entire United States and a lot of the marriages. So this huge marriage index collection of marriages keeps growing. By the way, this is an ongoing project. This isn't something that they're going to wait till they're done. If you get on Find My Past, you can search the records that have already been indexed and are available. So where are these marriage records? Well, beyond Find My Past, obviously there are a lot of them there. Once again, a family Bible. This is a tradition that was very prevalent in the United States and even into the colonies and before, that the family would own a large Bible, maybe not a big book, physically big, but it would be a very specifically maintained Bible. And many of these Bibles were published with pages between the Old and the New Testament, where records of the family members and births and deaths and things could be kept. And there were even forms made for these that were bound in with the Bible. If not, there was usually a blank page or two, and these were used by people to write about the important events in their family. Depending on the degree of persistence and responsibility of the family member maintaining this, they could be very extensive. In my experience, these particular Bible records have turned out to be absolutely the crucial, most valuable thing that we could find. I was doing some research in the South, in Mississippi, for a family that had come from the East Coast and moved across the country, which was not unusual, and ended up in Mississippi. I was able to make the first move back to Alabama when I found a picture online of the contents of a family Bible, not even part of the database for the program. I think the picture was on Ancestry, but it was just an image. It was not part of the records that were in Ancestry. So these are extremely valuable. Newspapers, almost always for hundreds of years, more or less, since there's been newspapers, they've been reporting marriages. And they're very, very likely to find some kind of a marriage announcements or a engagement announcement or whatever. And many times they're very detailed, telling even all the names of all the people who attended the marriage party, or names of the parents and any relatives that came to town. So this is a very productive place to look for marriage records. Surprisingly, obituaries usually mention the spouse, if there is one. In fact, if you want to know if someone was married, it's always a good idea to go to the newspapers or obituaries to see if the person was married. Now, obituaries are in newspapers, and newspapers are available in greater and greater quantities through digital record, being digitized and being put up online. But they're not, people say, well, I say there are all these digital newspapers. They say, well, they have the obituaries, and I usually say something like, well, no, they cut them out before they do the digitizing. No, they don't cut them out. They're there. And so it's just like reading a regular newspaper. That's the good news. The bad news is they're not going to tell you that there's an obituary there. You're going to have to read a lot of the newspapers. In many, many cases, you'll have to read the entire newspaper and look at all the obituaries for a whole run of newspapers over years to find one obituary. Cemeteries, family plots, places where people are buried. Many times spouses are buried together, and so this is a place where you can find out that a person was married. It may not have the information about when they were married, but you can determine, most of the time, determine the name of the spouse as well as the fact of the marriage. This is probably an interesting term that you might not be familiar with. This is Gretna Greens. It's named after a Scottish town where many people in England would go to get married if they didn't want people to be aware of the marriage directly. So, in other words, people who ran off to get married or eloped. Where do they do that? And now these types of places have been generalized and called Gretna Greens, even though Gretna Green is, the idea here has been long evident, and now there are places all over the country. In the United States, many people went to Las Vegas, Nevada to get married. People go to Niagara Falls, New York to get married. There are Atlantic City, New Jersey. There are many of these places. They're kind of like magnet places where people go when they want to get married, and they are very basically, they're all together called Gretna Greens, and that means that they're a place where people unexpectedly will turn up with a marriage. So when you're looking for marriage records, you need to find out. There are lists of these places, by the way. One place you can find information is in the Family Search Research Wiki, which is part of FamilySearch.org, but there are other places. If you look under Gretna Greens, there's sometimes listings of them. There were places in the New England, and there were places in the South that served the same purpose and function, usually because the requirements for getting married were less stringent than they were in the surrounding communities. Probate records, they're going to give you, once again, they're sort of like cemeteries. They're going to give you the information that says that the person was married, but may not have any specific information about the date or place of the marriage. But it very likely, depending on the time frame, that if you go to the probate record, that the person was very possibly married in the same place that the probate record existed. Land and property records. The reason why the marriage records are associated with land and property records, which, by the way, are also recorded in counties across the United States, is that when they, as I mentioned briefly, when someone got married, when someone gets married, that affects land and property rights. In the United States, there's been all sorts of different arrangements. One is called the dower interest of the wife, and in some cases, that dower interest could be released or waived or transferred, and the land and property records will show that, and that will then give positive proof of a marriage. What kinds of the records are associated with marriages? Now, these are the ways that the marriage the process of getting marriage was handled. The first level marriage records were called marriage banns, and in some areas of the world these are still practiced. In America, as particularly in early times and even up into the 1800s and into the 1900s, marriage bans were required by the church. And what that was, that for a time period, depending on the particular denomination and the particular rules of the church, the marriage had to be pronounced or announced in the church at least a period of time before the actual ceremony could take place. And it was basically a situation to allow anybody to come forward and protest against the wedding or say that there was some reason why it shouldn't take place. Most of us who have heard civil marriage ceremonies or even church marriages have heard those words repeated. If anyone objects to this couple getting married, then forever come forward or forever hold their peace or whatever, however it's said in the ceremony. But the marriage bans were even more specific. They would have for 2 or 3, as up to 3 weeks before a marriage, they would have to announce in the general congregation of the church that the couple were getting married. The main purpose of this obviously was to allow anyone who had a objection to the wedding, because the person was previously married or because there was some other either marriage or legal entanglement that would prevent the marriage from occurring. And so that's one type of record. And sometimes the marriage bans are the only record we have of the marriage. The actual wedding itself was not recorded, but the bans were recorded. And so you'll hear of this marriage by bans, for example, which means that they had to go through this process and have it. A marriage bond was another thing that might occur. In this case, there's all sorts of reasons why these bonds could have been required or were part of the situation. Generally speaking, you can kind of imagine some situations where there may be some property issues or some other relationship issues that would create a monetary problem because of the marriage. Because once the marriage was done, consummated and done, there were property right issues, and the bonds would protect people from the losses of any of the property that may have occurred through the marriage. It also whatever other reasons that were involved. But there are these ideas of actually creating a bond. That's not marriage bonds in the sense of the vows that the marriage partners take, but bonds of the money they have to put up to get them to get married. And then there are a lot of application and licensing requirements. This is more common, frequently more common in the last 100 years than it would have been 200 years ago, although even in old New English town records back in the early 1700s, there are mentions of having to obtain a license to marry. So it's not necessarily a modern innovation. Consent papers, these can take a lot of different forms. A consent paper may address the issue of an underage spouse if the wife or the husband was under the legal age. They may have to get consent from the parents before the wedding can take place. In some instances, with church weddings, it was a question of consanguinity, because what had to happen was you couldn't marry certain classes of your relatives. First, in some places it was first cousins, in some places second cousins, and even up to third cousins in some instances. And these consent papers would in a way be a way of waiving those restrictions and allowing the marriage to go forward for some reason that violated the norm of whatever the church or the community. There could be other consent things involved. It's a rather vague type of thing, but these were documents that were required in order for the marriage to go forward. Contracts or settlements. Here you go. This is another very broad category. Many people entered into marriage contracts, formal contracts. This was obviously more common among people who had a lot of property and a lot of assets and things than there would be for people who were very, very poor. But these contracts were basically conditional, and they usually had something to do with either the fact that there was an heir produced, or that if there was a separation, then it was determined beforehand how much property would be allocated to the spouse. Settlements, of course, anything could have been settled. A lot of people today have what are called prenuptial agreements. In fact, they call them prenups. And what these are agreements before two parties get married concerning the commingling of their property. They're usually more common in states like Arizona and Texas and so forth that are common law, or excuse me, community property states. Because even if a person comes to the state and goes and gets married, the wife automatically, and the property is commingled, then the wife automatically obtains a 50% interest in undivided interest in all the property owned by the marital community. So sometimes there were contracts attempting to modify or prevent that from happening, which were honored by the state, by the way. If there's that kind of a contract and there's some basis for making that contract, then they were usually enforceable. Okay, we're going to move on here to death records. Deaths, like births, were not always recorded, and we didn't have uniform reporting in the United States until the early 1900s. So once again, death records are not going to be found if the further you go back into the 1800s. Again, you'll find those in the churches and other places. And most of the states, some states, but I would say most, have limited access to death records for a time period after the death of the person. So if you're trying to get a death certificate for one of your linear ancestors, you may find some time restrictions, particularly if it's your own parents or your grandparents. You will have to prove your relationship to the state in order to obtain the record. And this is important to remember, that the death records are kept in the place where the people died, not where they were buried. I had a grandfather who died in Pasadena, California, and he was buried in Salt Lake City, Utah. And it's not unusual that people are buried in a place that's different than the place that they die, particularly among military personnel and others who have the wishes to be buried with their family, even though they live at a great distance from where the family may have been. So now we look at places for death records, church records again, as I have already mentioned a couple of times. And in fact, in most parts of the United States, especially in the eastern part of the United States, burials are associated with the churches, and many of the churches have cemeteries either surrounding the church or adjacent to the church, and those records are kept by the churches themselves. Again, family Bibles. There are what are called U.S. Census mortality schedules, and they are records that were kept by the Census Bureau for the year prior to the federal census. So along with looking at the census records, you can look at those kinds of records. Social Security Death Index is another, and that is only, of course, applicable during the time Social Security has been in existence. This is a database of people who have died who had Social Security. And so after 1930s, mid-1930s, you begin to suspect. But generally speaking, the cutoff here is 1960. If a person lived and died before 1960, they may or may not had Social Security. But after 1960, it's pretty common that everybody had a Social Security number. Obituaries, of course, talked about. They mention where a person is going to be buried. Newspaper accounts of the burial or the death, or of the cause of death, investigation of the death, or whatever, can often report where the person was going to be buried. And again, probate records. Now, in my experience, probate records are not a very good place to determine the exact. They tell exactly when a person died, by the way, almost uniformly, but they don't necessarily report where they are buried. And cemeteries, as I mentioned, may or may not be accurate. Here is a census record, which hopefully is familiar to nearly everyone who is doing genealogical research. This is one of the first records that we come across as we're doing research in the United States, because the census were taken every 10 years beginning in 1790. And now the latest census that's available, because of the 72-year privacy issue, was 1940, and then will be 72 years from 1950 or 19, whatever that is. I'm not going to do that one in my head. I think I've got it in here anyway. But the U.S. federal census is every 10 years beginning in 1790. Almost all of the 1890 U.S. federal census was lost due to a fire and government error. The censuses from 1850 forward have a lot more information and a lot of the names of family members than from 1790 to 1840. Many of the states have their own periodic censuses. New York censuses, for example, were taken in the halfway through, so in the fives. So there's a 1910 U.S. census, and then there would be a 1915 census in some of the states that did that at the halfway point. There are different kinds of schedules, including the Indian schedules, mortality schedules, manufacturing and social statistics, all sorts of additional schedules that may or may not be available on the websites where you look at the original, what are called population schedules, which list all the people. Where are the records? Primarily kept by the U.S. National Archives in Washington, D.C., but they're also available on Family Search, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage.com, FindMyPast.com, Archive.org, and many other websites. These are just the larger, more prominent ones that have complete copies of the census records. Archive.org has through 1930, but the other ones, other websites have all the way through 1940. The United States Archives has the original copies of the census records, but the digital copies are maintained by separate websites. Cemetery records. This is a picture of a lovely garden spot cemetery out on the Colorado Plateau in northern Arizona. You may question why someone would want to be buried out here, and the answer is, well, this is where they lived, and this is what they were used to, so it was kind of the place where they were buried. There are some very, very useful online cemetery websites. I mentioned at the beginning, Find a Grave. This is the second most popular genealogy website on the web, and after Ancestry, and it's interesting that Ancestry now owns Find a Grave, so Ancestry has the first, number one, and number two most popular genealogy websites. Next is a program called Billion Graves, which is mainly distinguished from Find a Grave by the fact that individual volunteers take pictures of the grave markers, whatever they may be, and they are uploaded through the GPS function of the device through a smartphone or a tablet, and that then goes directly into Billion Graves with a GPS marker marking exactly where the grave is located. Very, very helpful in finding graves in very big cemeteries. It's called Billion Graves. I'm not sure they're up to 1 billion yet, but that's their goal, is to get at least 1 billion grave sites registered. And it's very fast growing, a little bit newer. And if you want a lot of information, user contributed, by the way, to go to Find a Grave. And there's less information in Billion Graves about the individuals, but there's exact information about the locations of the graves and a lot of other ways to look at the grave markers. Interment.net is another large online database of graves in the United States. U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs National Cemetery Administration Nationwide Gravesite Locator. All that long thing by the U.S. government means is the veterans' burials. And if you're a veteran in the United States, you can apply to be buried in a national cemetery, and they will offset the cost of doing that to some extent. For the United Kingdom, there's deceasedonline.com, and there are other websites, but Find a Grave and Billion Graves are mostly international in scope, and they're all over the world now with people contributing cemetery photos and information about the cemeteries. Doing a cemetery records is search the online indexing programs like Billion Graves and Find a Grave. Make a concerted effort to locate the death place and circumstances, and then investigate all the associated records. To find where the person is buried can become a major challenge. It is either very simple because all of it, there it is on Find a Grave and you've got a picture of the headstone, or it might be extremely elusive. Do an extensive newspaper search for an obituary. This is if you haven't found the grave yet. Identify the religious preference of the deceased so that you can find a church record, and then search maps for cemeteries in the area where the ancestor died. And I guess the supreme example of involvement in genealogy is getting in your car and driving around on back roads trying to find the cemeteries, which some of us have done on many occasions. Obituaries, here's an example from the Beaver County newspaper, and they give some information about the deceased and the family, and a little bit about what the person did in their lifetime, and usually mention some dates, and some people that they were married to. The information you can get from obituaries are surnames, the given name, the maiden names of the females, the birth year, the death year, place of the death, and some of the family members, and perhaps a short biography. Some of these are not so short. In today's world, people actually pay by the word for a publication in a newspaper or an online obituary program, and so they might turn out to be rather short, but in some cases they go on, and they're pretty long. When you're looking at obituaries, it's really a basis of going through newspapers, and a lot of the newspapers, even more current ones, are held by the newspapers themselves, and so you're going to need to do some searching around the newspapers in the area. There's always some kind of an assumption, I think, by most people that the obituary is going to be found in the most popular newspaper. I would, in some families, I would look at the cheapest one, where it would be least, where it had the least cost. So it's really kind of difficult sometimes to determine. In a county, there might be 10 or 15 newspapers published, and it could have been in any one of the newspapers or all of them. There are a huge number, hundreds of online digital newspaper websites, and quite a few very, very large websites, and these are a good place to start looking for your obituaries. Public libraries often have archives. They may even have an index of obituaries. When I was working down in the Mesa Family History Library down in Mesa, Arizona, they were maintaining an obituary list on their website. So there's all sorts of places where you might find that information. Of course, the large online genealogical database programs. Interestingly enough, online obituaries out of the newspapers, where they've actually been segregated out as obituary websites, only have been popular for the last few years. And so most of them began in the 1970s and the 1980s. So you're not going to get a long way back to get into your ancestors looking at some of these online obituary programs. Always check before you get looking at spending any time as to how far back the obituaries go, because sometimes they don't go very far back. Online Google searches for the person's name might turn up and some details with modifying the like places and things like that. May very well turn up an obituary. It's interesting because people sometimes post them on their own websites or whatever, and they show up. In today's world, I'd be looking on Facebook for people who might have passed away. In fact, some acquaintances that I had, friends that I had that died, that I couldn't contact their family for some reason. I was able to find out confirm their death on Facebook. Biographies are books. Primarily, they could be very short, like a pamphlet, but they could be very, very long. And they are, in finding biographies, we're looking at digital books online. And there are millions upon millions of digital books, tens of millions of digital books online. And searching for the names of the ancestors on Google and on the other large digital book sites. We've done webinars on finding digital books. So there are some BYU webinars about digital books. We'd like to, this is something you could get into with a lot of detail. Why aren't I moving? Something just happened. There we go. Put the names you're looking for and all the variations in quotation marks to indicate the specific name or sequence of words that you're looking for. Search on worldcat.org, which is the catalog of catalogs, has 2 billion catalog entries. And this is a place to look for books, and it'll tell you about if an ebook is available in many cases. So you can search for your surnames and even the names of your ancestors, and then usually put the word biography or genealogy or something with your search terms so that you're limited to that type of person, realizing, of course, that there are very common, all names might turn out to be common, and you'll come back with a lot of extraneous responses in your searches. If you want to continue learning how to do all of this in very much more detail than I've been able to cover in just this 1-hour webinar, I'd recommend the Family History Guide. It's thefhguide.com, and it's a structured sequence way to learn more about how to do research and where all these records are, and it has hundreds and hundreds of links to videos and instructional material that'll be very helpful in teaching you how to do more research in genealogy. It's thefhguide.com. Very good resource for this information. If you go beyond the basics, go with Family History Research Wiki, which is part of FamilySearch.org, and this will take you out to all different types of records with instructions on what they are, as well as how to find them and where they are located. So thanks for watching today. We appreciate those who've tuned in. We're also reminding everyone that these webinars are uploaded to the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. And if you go to the youtube.com and search for BYU Family History Library, you'll find our list. We are nearing 200 videos at the time that this particular video was made. By the time you watch this, it may be a much higher number, since we're putting up a lot of videos regularly. And thanks again for watching, and remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Thank you very much, James, for another wonderful webinar. We'd like to remind everybody about our upcoming presentations. If you click on the link here on the bottom of the screen, it will take you to our webinar website where you can open up our schedule for the rest of this month and also for the schedule in November, so you can kind of plan ahead and see what we have coming up. We would like to invite everyone to join us next time, and we hope to see you then.